Hello everybody. Hello my friends of the world. I hope you can hear me. I am here to introduce to you this new session of the energy webinars from INESC TEC. And I wish to thank you first of all for your patience in attending our sessions. And I am grateful for a faithful audience with very large numbers. Actually, what we are trying to do is to share insights and share novelty on research efforts with application implications. In fact, this series of webinars, they are not tutorials, they are not classes, they are not also paper presenting conferences or anything. They are moments for sharing new research, new results, nevertheless with practical implications, and in many cases done together with companies. And the idea behind these webinars is to present not only work at INESC TEC, but also work from our colleagues, friends, or associated groups, allied research centers, etc. So we are also inviting people from other research centers or other institutions, even companies, to come and share with us this space to the web. So the purpose is to establish dialogue and let the community know the advances that have been happening with the research effort in our areas. And today we are having two presentations in a new topic, and in a very challenging and interesting topic, which is a fashion today, but it's for a reason. You know that one of the revolutions in modern research in power systems has been in the area of data analytics or energy analytics, and in more general, intelligent systems, intelligent models, and learning from data. And so today we are going to address this in two presentations, and because this is to be focused, presentations are organized in such a way that we will not spend more than 20 minutes with each presentation, and we will allow time for people to ask questions and to receive some answers. And I will be watching together with Joanna Coelho, who is helping me in this organization. So anyone who wishes to ask a question can ask it in writing or can raise a hand. I hope you know how to raise hands with the Zoom. And I will find the moments to interrupt the presentations to allow the presenters to answer questions. Or at the end of the presentation, we'll also have some time for some discussion. And this is to be in a compact model. I don't want any one of you to fall asleep. So we'll go straight away to the first presentation, which is from this gentleman that I'm going to present you by sharing the screen. Someone is telling me that the audio is very poor. I would like to receive some confirmation that you are listening very well. But meanwhile, while I don't receive that confirmation, I will share the screen with you to let you know about the first presenter. So the first presenter is Kamalatan Ganesan, or Kamal, as we call him usually. And he is a final year student in the PhD program in Sustainable Energy Systems from the MIT program, Portugal program in Portugal, here at the University of Porto. And he graduated from the University of Southampton with a master's degree in Sustainable Energy Technologies. And his current focus is in, as you can read, understanding the elasticity of residential consumers' behavior to aid in designing appropriate demand response programs. And he says that he likes to think Bayesian, which is a funny definition of himself. I also happen to know that he's from Chennai in India. And if you are interested in those details, and I am ready to pass the floor to him if I can. So let's see, Kamal, are you ready to are you ready to do your presentation?
Yeah, yes, Professor. 1 second.
Very well. So the floor is yours, or the screen is yours, if I can say. Okay, so please start.
Yeah. I hope this is okay. Sure. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon or good evening, where from different parts of the world. So this is a different time right now. And I am Kamalnathan Ganeshan, and I am a PhD student on a final year with the University of Porto and also with INESC TEC. Am I? Okay. Initially, I will start with my presentation with a short introduction covering my motives and objectives, and then follow up with the framework and the model that we have developed with some results. So it's quite important that in a demand response program, engaging the consumer to participate is a high priority for a retailer or utility. For example, when you have products such as computers or phones that are on sale, it won't be of interest to a consumer if you're not looking for it. So if you're not looking for it, or if you're not available for a particular resource, then you're not going to provide your flexibility, or you're not going to provide your service to it. So it is quite determinant that if a retailer is able to understand this availability, that a consumer is available at this particular period to provide their flexibility, that is a very big advantage to design a appropriate demand response program. So usually in domestic electricity consumption, it is hard to identify when a consumer is available for flexibility. So using a single elasticity value to stamp on a consumer saying that, okay, this is a single value that you have, and this is how your flexibility is going to be, that narrows down the available flexibility and the opportunity that the consumer can provide. And for a retailer, it's highly important to understand the reliability that the consumer brings to the table. So taking these issues into consideration, we developed a consumption elasticity profile that will help the retailer to better tune their demand response offers. It also helps to understand how the prices have an impact on the consumption. So if the prices do really matter, or if the prices do not really matter for a particular consumer, because there could be different other types of incentives that can be provided other than just prices. But in my research, I concentrate on price-based incentives. And so we also try to make a consumer's flexibility as an attractive resource for the market. So, my model, my complete functional model depends on three sub-models, you can say it that way. The first one is based on causal inference framework with a Robin G method. The second model is on consumer probability scores with Dirichlet multinomial distribution. The elasticity behavior model with generalized linear model. The last two models are based on Bayesian inferences, probability distributions. So for our first model, so we examine the consumer's demand response behavior. This is basically done by using data-driven algorithms, and the main algorithm that we use here is the causal inference technique. So the retailer sets the demand response strategy, and then which is sent to the consumers periodically as signals and to the contracted clients. And we consider the client's consumption, the associated demand response prices, the time components, and the rest of the features like temperature and ambient temperature and what sorts into the causal inference model. the average consumption and the elasticity for each of these hours is computed and ranked to identify the best set of clients. In my perspective, knowing the average elasticity is more important than identifying a sporadic highest and lowest consumption, because it gives a much clearer and consistent response behavior. In this presentation, I have not touched in terms of the posterior probability from causal inference using the R model. This is a methodology developed by Google, and we used this in our model to validate our results. This could be referenced in the paper that we have published, and so I have not presented that material in the presentation here. So the first algorithm, in general, most experiments will rely on using two groups of consumers, so that are identical in most ways, except that one would receive a treatment and the other wouldn't receive the treatment. And the experiments are performed with these two sets of consumers at the same time. However, this sometimes tends to be quite expensive and quite tedious, because you have to make sure that both the set of consumers are behaving quite similarly to each other, and both have the same conditions and what sorts. And the collection of such data and the availability of such data is also a big importance these days, because of the losses in data transmission and everything. So in reality, this would be a difficult situation to be in, but it's the thing that is currently being used. The other way of doing these kinds of analysis is using observational methods. And this is to try to understand the causal effect in the absence of an experiment. So basically, you do the inference before the intervention happened and after the intervention happened, and then you identify where if the intervention actually had a cause in the change in consumption. So we used an approach to identify a specific set of sub-consumers within the demand response programs, and who would basically respond to a specific DR period. So for each specific period, we end up identifying a group of consumers who are highly reliable and who are least reliable. So this way you can have your own separate sub pool of consumers within the entire contracted clients in a DR program. The algorithm uses the parametric G formula as the causal inference estimator to analyze the causal effects. So the causal effect basically refers to the distribution of a conditional expectation of a variable y given x, controlling the set of covariates z to make the effect identifiable. So these covariates z must be considered in such a way that they should not have any, as I've mentioned in the previous slide, it should not have any backdoor criteria, such that any changes in either of x or y should not end up having a change in the covariate z. So in our analysis, we use the x variable to be price, and z and x are statistically dependent, basically. So, and the model used by default to minimize the mean squared error and to do the controlling is the kernel regression model, which gives us the conditional expectation equations, as you can see here. The model returns the y estimates at each x value. So you end up controlling the z variables, and for different values of x, that is our price, you end up with y estimates, different y estimates. And the z intervals are your elasticity averages that you end up identifying from this model. So basically, this is the alpha level z-score for a two-tailed test. And this is based on the standard deviation and the average estimations that we get out of this model. And the data set, in a way, we considered was quite, to say, a large data set. It was from a London carbon, low carbon London data set, which was done in 2012 and 2013, no, 2013 and 2014. And we considered 81 consumers from them in such a way that we can have a diverse profile of consumption, not like randomly picking, but to pick a diverse profile of consumers in our model so that we can identify the exact elasticities and quantify them. And they also, so we used the prices that they were giving were like time of use prices with 3 different levels. And on the right, you can see the different inputs that we collected from the database. In terms of our results, we have for 2 consumers right here. The consumer on top, you can see that we have our average consumption as well as the average elasticity. So it's quite clear that the average consumption changes as the different prices have changed. And in terms of the elasticity, it also produces the same thing. But it's quite interesting to note that there is something different here, because the consumer shows elasticity during morning and night peak periods. This is usually not something that we associate with flexibility in terms of a residential consumer, because we always assume, like usually the retailers or anybody who's designing a program assumes that during these peak hours, the elasticity is not readily available. But in our analysis, we have found that there are many consumers who are readily available to provide elasticity even during these peak periods. And the one on the bottom is another consumer who's also showed some promises for elasticity. But if you see that, it's quite clear that the elasticity provided by this consumer is not at a bigger level. The level of elasticity is quite small. So this is where it is very important to note that even though there are consumers who sign up for the demand response program, they do not actively participate. Or in our analysis, we have also seen that there are consumers who participate during the first few weeks or first few months of the demand response program, and then gradually die out. This is basically because our electricity consumptions in terms of a residential electricity consumption is more unconscious. So the more conscious you are, the more active the consumer is going to be. But in a day-to-day perspective, our electricity consumption is mostly unconscious, and it's quite hard to identify these elasticities that are there. And with our with the causality model that we are able to identify, like I said, specific set of consumers in the entire contacted consumers, to identify who are the better consumers and who are the least consumers. But it is also, okay, there was a question, I'm sorry. It is also important to specify that our model is also able to measure the performance of the reliability of the demand response program. So these clients are weighted amongst the whole pool of consumers. So you get consumers with a highly reliable for a given period, and there are consumers who are not highly reliable. So by accumulating these weights of each clients, we can find the top actively participating clients. So here in the plot, you can see amongst the top 5%, you can see 15 and 18 clients who are for the lower and higher prices who are actively participating. But then when you relax the elasticity participation, you relax the participation of the consumers to 63%, then you have all the 81 clients participating in it. So this quite clearly indicates that not all the consumers are benefited from the demand response program. So essentially the goal of the retailer, or the goal of the people who are enforcing these demand response programs, should be to maximize the most elastic region in such a way that they can increase their profit margins and also provide better reliable services to the market. The next model, as I mentioned, relies on multinomial distribution. So we build this model with the observed elasticity and their weights from the causality framework, along with a prior distribution being a Dirichlet distribution. So usually a beta distribution is for a single binomial probability, whereas the Dirichlet model models the probability of multiple choices. So, sorry. It is parameterized based on the alpha, which is our concentration parameter, and it represents the weight for each of the choices. So we assume that each observation in is an independent trial, and so you can consider the alpha as a pseudo count. So this means that it indicates the effectiveness or the reliability of our consumer. So initially for our model, we considered that all consumers are, the considered consumers are equally participating in a model, equally participating in a demand response signal. And then we simulate them to see what would be the probability of each of these consumers accepting a given signal, a given demand response signal during a given period based on their past elasticities. So for our prior theta here, we use a non-informative uniform distribution. And then we, like I said, by initializing the prior Dirichlet variable with a series of ones for the parameter alpha. And so to identify this, like I said, we would be following the Bayesian inference techniques for identifying the posterior probability distribution. Our distribution is characterized by K and alpha, and it is, and these are called these are the hyperparameters because they are the parameters for our priors. So the larger the pseudo count, which is our alpha, which is our concentration parameter, the larger the pseudo counts, we will have the particular consumer will have a greater effect on the posterior estimation, while the smaller values will have a lesser effect. So in case after analysis, in case the the retailer believes or understands that during a particular hour, a consumer is going to have a higher say or a higher reliability in participating, then this consumer can have a higher pseudo count compared to the other consumers considered for that period. So, and to make it simpler, instead of 81 clients, I've just made one for 5 clients. And here it is quite clear, like the first consumer provides quite literally one of the best reliabilities, the probability of accepting the demand response for different hours, whereas a consumer 5 has quite the opposite, except for the first earlier hours during the first hour to the 4th hour or so. And for our last model, we have to identify, so per se, in our initial model, for the first 2 models, we have identified the elasticity and the consumptions based on 3 price signals. So our idea was to identify the consumption elasticities for if they experience prices from different perspectives, like prices that were not there. So these to identify this, we ended up using the generalized linear model. So our main goal is to model it to identify how the consumer reacts to different prices based on ones they have received. So like to identify an unobserved data. So instead of using a classical approach of multiple linear regressions, we rely on a probabilistic approach. So we reformulate the regression model to probabilistic distribution. And the advantages are that we can quantify any prior knowledge we have by replacing the priors on the parameters. So this can be as informative as the time series prolongs, as there are more new data that could be added to make our assumptions much better, make our priors much better in such a way that we are more accurate in identifying what their elasticities can be. So we also do not get a single estimation for the beta values, but we get a posterior distribution. So we can identify based on these distributions, like what our how much effect our price has, or how much of an effect any other feature has in our model on the elasticities. So this model addresses the basic formulation to identify the maximum likelihood of attaining our observed elasticity. So we use from our first model, we use the observed elasticity that we already have along with the price and the temperatures for the different profiles, the price and temperature profiles for the different periods, and then understand and estimating the elasticity estimation that you want for the upper and the lower limits. So this gives a kind of a freedom to the retailer to understand for a particular hour, if the retailer requires a particular amount of elasticity, the retailer can understand how the spread of the elasticity is going to be for different prices. So he can make a well-informed decision of how each of these consumers are going to provide elasticity. But it should be noted that we have to carefully identify the priors for each of these consumers, because this is a bespoke model for each individual consumer that would end up identifying the total elasticity that can be obtained. So here, like I said, knowing the credible intervals for each of these values shows more information about how representative our model is. So we have the distribution of 3 consumers here. And then, as you can see, like we have the mean elasticity profile and the elasticity quantile. Elasticity quantile is more like, this is the range to which that you can expect the consumer to shift their elasticities based on the mean elasticity. So I have to mention here that we worked with time of use tariffs, which were like 3 tariffs throughout the pilot period. And then, so we relied on using a generalized linear model. In case if there is a situation where we have a scenario where consumers have experienced, say, like a dynamic tariff, then this model can be replaced by a quadratic model, because in a situation where like you could always expect the elasticities for a lower price and the higher price to be much different compared to a default price, as we have already shown. So this is more replicated in a quadratic function. And if we have more than like a dynamic tariff, if you have more prices, then this would reflect on the model. So our tool can be used to identify how a consumer basically reacts to different prices, not just the one that we're given, but based on those 3 given prices, we can see from different prices how they react for the different time period and the expected elasticity. Well, this is an overall elasticity profile. So in case, like I said before, if a retailer wants to understand for a specific hour, how each of the consumers react, then the same model can be used, where here we show you like for each and every specific hour in terms of the original data and the mean elasticity that we have, and then the expected elasticity that we can get from the others. And this is quite a way to represent how a single consumer for a different hour, for a different temperature scenarios, and for different elasticity estimations that the retailer needs, you can identify how the change in the elasticities occur. So this is a plot where one of the consumers seem to have like a varied consumption elasticity, especially during the midday, where you can see for a higher price, he kind of has a more elasticity, whereas during the rest of the periods of the day, he seems to have quite closer to a same elasticity period throughout the day. This is the same when you see for the second half of the day, where he starts off with a higher elasticity for larger prices, but the same thing settles down during the peak periods. So this is quite indicative of a normal consumer in a residential scenario, where during the peak periods, he seems to provide quite a flat elasticity, whatever your price is going to be. It doesn't really matter what price the consumer receives. His elasticity is going to still stay the same. So in the end, what's more important is that our framework that we have built here helps to identify the actual availability of a consumer, and if the retailer would be considering them for the DR activity or not. And it also, like in specific, like when I mentioned at the beginning, like there are consumers who sign up for sign up for these contracts, but they do not exactly participate. So it also paves a new way in which you can perform identify the most reliable consumers and then have performance-based payments, which would increase the engagement, which would motivate the consumers to perform better so that their reimbursements could be more. And we can also address why and where the consumer is lacking in elasticity, and we can identify how we can address this. And we can also check if the DR strategy is as effective as one seems to be or not. So, and lastly, when building this model, we made sure that the scalability of our model is very important, so that it is not very narrow, that it can't be used in other scenarios. There could also be scenarios where like you can replace the consumer, a residential consumer, to say like a service building or like any other kind of buildings where you can use the resources or the data that is collected from these resources as, say, consumers, and then you can identify the elasticities from these separate resources rather than using this as a model only for the residential consumers elasticity. So
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
And I thank and I would like to finish with like thanking INESC and to for giving me this platform and like for helping me to work with like a few great people in the industry for developing these models and as well. And the following speaker also has worked with me, and it was a great pleasure to meet other people and then work in this portfolio to, especially during the important period of my career. So
Thank
thanks
you
for
very
giving
much.
time for this.
Thank you very much, Kamal. I appreciate your presentation. Please stop sharing.
Yeah.
Yes, and thank you so much. And I have some questions from the audience, and I am sorry, Kamal, you got excited and you exceeded a little bit your time. So we need to compress a little bit the question time, but dialogue is the most important thing in science. So well, perhaps not the most, one of them. There are several important things. Okay, but I would like really to have a short dialogue, and I will move immediately to one of the questions. Please answer the question from Francesco, who has been also excited in asking this question, and I will read it for you and read aloud for everybody. In your analysis, did you consider also electric vehicles and heat pumps to assess the elasticity or demand response, or did you just consider the elasticity generated by conventional appliances?
So for our analysis, most of the there was a mix of consumers. There were certain consumers who had DGs installed in them, like PV panels and electric vehicles. But there, as far as I remember, there were not any consumers in considering heat pumps. But yes, it was a mix of consumers who also had elasticities from the electric vehicles and pumps. Sorry, PV panels. This is explained in our in our presentation, in our publication. Sorry.
Very well, Francesco. If you want to comment, you can also raise your hand, and I will give you the microphone. But here's a question from Chandan Lee. Thanks for your very interesting presentation, Kamal. Could you explain more about how dynamic pricing influences the model?
So, well, that's a good question, because in terms of dynamic pricing, what I generally mean is like when you're when you're usually the prices that the consumers at the end point see are like not the exact market variations. So in case of dynamic pricing, this wouldn't be the case, because this would be probably closely related to how the market price fluctuates. And yes, to a certain fact, considering this in terms of a residential consumer would be quite difficult, because it's not as unconscious consumption as it is. This wouldn't exactly see the effect that it has, but it should also not be not be given away, because there could be consumers who are much more keener than, like I mentioned, who are much more keener to participate even during periods that are not demand response instigated. And these consumers might quite have a bigger say when it comes to dynamic pricing. But for sure, dynamic pricing works a lot better if they're for service buildings or something else other than the residential consumers. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. I have here another question from Fabian Zinho. Yeah. He sent also a hug to his friends from INESC TEC, and he asked a question on how can one mitigate the social imbalances that new schemes might introduce, and he explains under performance-based compensations to elasticity, the people that have high installed capacities, heat pumps, electric vehicles, batteries, will be more compensated than low or medium income households with little equipment and low power demand. So any ideas on how you can mitigate the social imbalances from these schemes?
Yes, there is, okay. So at least in the European perspective, there is a new kind of rule that they have called the SRI, which indicates the level of intelligence, or the I'm not sure of the abbreviation, but the level of intelligence your building has. So in case you're going to sign a contract with for your elasticity or something, you can based on these SRIs, based on the level of SRI that each of your buildings have, your consumers can be put into a separate pool. So you can have a performance-based rebate, performance-based payments sectioned within these. So you don't need to, you can pool the consumers who have a higher SRI, so they won't be having any sort of influence compared to people who have a lower SRI but are still willing to participate in the market.
Oh, very well. Now I'm going to the last question, and the person asking the question is me.
Thank you.
Well, it's more like a thought that I would like to listen to your ideas, which is this: are we really assessing the elasticity of the human behavior, or of the intelligent algorithms behavior that will likely exist in households, in commercial buildings, etc. At some point, elasticity will be the response of algorithms, not of people.
Yes, in a way, yes, because like I said, there will be certainly points where like you are not consciously sure what the where you're providing these elasticities. So these elasticities are going to be based on how randomized your behavior is. So these solutions in a way will be easier for both parties in a way, I would say, because it would be easier for the party on the other side to understand where he can actually focus his attention to, and you don't need to pay so much attention to your own elasticities, because that is already taken care of by your own this AI, say, in the future.
Yeah, that's how I see it. When you include energy boxes, ultra smart meters that take care not only of measurements but also take care of managing the generation and appliances in the home, etc. Ultimately, it's the nature of the software that will be measured by these kinds of algorithms, and you may even influence the choice of software, because
yes.
right. for new business offer, this is a nice avenue, and I'll let this idea for the audience to digest. While I thank Kamal for his presentation, he was a dedicated researcher at INESC TEC, and I'm so happy to see that he's enthusiastic in his work. And we will move to the next speaker. So it will be Margot Reger, which I asked Margot to show herself. Yes, very well. Hello, Margot. Salut, ça va bien? Tout va bien avec toi? I must also say just a nice word in French so that he feels comforted. And I'm going to share with you a presentation of Margot so that you can understand where she's coming from. Let me see if this is Ganesh. And here is Margot. Now, this is the official presentation. So she's now a third year PhD student at EDF, Research and Development in Saclay, at the Mathematics Laboratory d'Orsay, and in Sierra team at INRIA in Paris. She graduated in Aeronautics and the Space Institute Superior, and her master's degree is in applied mathematics. So she's not an engineer, lucky for her. But her research focus presently is bandit models. So take care with your purses, because bandits will be around in our presentation. But she's a very interesting person that spent also months with INESC TEC in Porto, in Portugal, and made friends with other people. And she sent me an interesting personal presentation that I cannot resist to show you. This was her slide presentation. I had to do the other slide. But you can see that she likes to paint and draw, I believe. She says it has little to do with machine learning. I'm not so sure of that. but it's basically Margot. Here you are in front of her. She's speaking from France, and I will ask her to start sharing the screen. Okay.
Okay, so firstly, I'm very thankful for the invitation. So I also wanted to thank the Power and Energy team for their warm welcome at INESC, and I really appreciate to discover the institute, but also the city to eat bacalhau and drink wine. Okay. So I'm going to talk about deep learning and demand response, as the title suggested. And all I'm going to present is a joint work with Ricardo Bessa. Okay, so firstly, I really need to introduce you to my PhD subject, because you have to understand why we did this work. Okay, so the story started 3 years ago in France. So as you all know, electricity is really hard to store. So the balance between production and demand must be maintained at any time. So in France, what we do is we forecast the demand and then we adapt production accordingly. It is quite easy to do that in France because we have a lot of hydro and of nuclear plants. So we just have to schedule the production according to the demand. But as in Portugal, we would like to have more and more renewable energy. And this comes with some problem because these new energies are subjected to weather condition. And so the production becomes harder to adjust according to the demand. At the same time, with new communication tools like smart meters, we can have access to more and more data and also to communicate very fast with the clients. So all this context suggests demand response. The idea is to send signals to clients in order to manage the electricity demand. So in my PhD, we wanted to develop automatic solution to dynamically choose these incentive signals. And to do that, the algorithm has to learn the client behavior, so how a client respond to some tariff variation, but in the same time, the algorithm has to optimize the tariff he sends in order to influence the consumption according to the production. So we talk about exploitation trade-off, and to deal with this kind of problem, we classically use a reinforcement learning algorithm. And in my PhD, I tried to adapt bandit theory to this problem. So just here at the bottom of the slide, I show the average consumption over 5 days of the clients of the same data sets as Kamal presented to you. And here in black, you can see this is the drop of the consumption when a high tariff is sent, and in gray is the rise of the consumption when a low tariff is sent. So you can see that tariff has an impact on the consumption, and so all this stuff makes sense. Okay, so now imagine that, okay, you spend 2 years working hard on your PhD, and you think that you have a good idea and that the algorithm is okay, and you would like to apply this bandit algorithm to real data. The main issue is that you can't do that. Why? It's quite simple. Actually, the real data, in the real data set, tariffs have been chosen according to some policy, and you want to try an alternative policy. So the thing is, what happens if you change here the price? You want to know, I mean, you can't know what could have been the consumption. So the solution we found to test our bandit problem is to simulate some new data. So I came in Porto to work with Ricardo Bessa in order to create some data generators in order to test our bandit algorithm. So we developed two approaches. So the first one is a semi-parametric approach. It relies on a model. So the power consumption Y here is modeled as a function of some contextual variable. These contextual variables could be, for example, the temperature, the tariff, the day of the week, etc. So this function F models the expectation of this random variable, and to model the random character of the power consumption, you add some noise here. Okay, so this approach is nice because it's interpretable. Like, for example, you can see what is the effect of the prices on the demand. And it also can be interesting to illustrate the theory, because in our bandit algorithm, we actually make the assumption that the consumption was following this model. The thing is that in real life, you don't know. You don't know what happened. And this is why we wanted to develop a second generator, a black box approach, which is completely data-driven, and it relies on deep learning techniques. And this black box approach would be good to test the robustness of our algorithm. Okay, so before explaining a bit more the two approach, I'm just going to rapidly present the data again. So it's exactly the same data set as Kamal. So you have 1,000 clients subjected to dynamic time of use, and there is 3 tariffs, high, low, or normal. Okay. Okay, so we add some new variables to this data set. Actually, we add the temperatures and also some calendar variables, like, for example, the day of the week and the hour of the day. Okay, so one thing I didn't tell you, and it's quite crucial, is that our bandit algorithm will personalize the send of the incentive signals. So he will choose to which clients he is gonna send a high tariff and to which clients he is gonna send a low tariff. And to do so, we have to cluster the clients according to their responsiveness to the tariff, okay? And this is where Kamal gets into the game, because we use his elasticity approach to cluster the clients. The idea is that for each client, we will build an electricity demand profile and also an elasticity profile. And then we will sum up all that profile into a few features that are used to cluster the clients. And here you can see how we cluster the clients. So we choose to have 4 clusters. And you can see that the demand curves are varies from a cluster to another. Okay, so right now I'm gonna show you our black box approach. So it relies on neural networks. So I hope that everyone is a bit familiar with neural networks. We used here some conditional variational encoders. And before presenting to you conditional variational encoders, I'm just gonna talk to you about just auto encoders. Originally, the auto encoders were built for dimension reduction. So the idea is that you have 2 neural networks, so the encoder here and the decoder here. And in input of the encoder, you put your data, you want to reduce the dimension. So for example, here in our setting, it will be some consumption profile. So here you have a daily consumption profile, so a 48 dimension vector corresponding to the consumption of each alpha hour of the day, okay? And then the encoder will encode this vector into a very low dimension vector Z here, okay? You just forgot this part for right now. So he will encode the Y into Z, okay? And then the decoder will try to rebuild the original vector Y, okay? The main problem with autoencoders is that if you put enough neurons here, you can just, for example, encode the first profile of your dataset with 1, the second with 2, the third with 3, etc. And the decoder will decode the 1 into the first sample of your data, the second into 2, etc. And then you just reduce the dimension of your dataset to 1, but this has completely no sense because you have overfitting your data, and this is actually not what you want to do. So this is why Kingma and Welling developed variational autoencoder. Actually, they assume that in the low dimension space, so the space where variable Z lives, so we call it the latent space. So the idea is that the data in the latent space are distributed according to a Gaussian. So right now, the encoder encodes 2 variables, mu and sigma, that are the mean and the variance of the Gaussian. And then you simulate a new data thanks to mu and sigma. And this is this new variable which is decoded, okay? And with this regularization, it's much better. We obtain very good result, and it's also a good thing for interpretability of in the latent space. Okay, and then when you have a variational autoencoder, it is actually very easy to simulate new data. You just have to sample here from new data thanks to a Gaussian, okay, and then you decode this variable, and you simply generate new variable like that, okay? And a conditional variational encoder is simply a variational encoder where you add some context, like for example, here you will add the temperature and the tariff, and by adding this contextual variables, you put them as the input of the encoder as well as the input of the decoder in order to give some context to your variational autoencoder. Okay, I hope it's clear. And so when you want to train a variational autoencoder, you have to set a lot of hyperparameters. I am not going to detail all that stuff here, but you can go to see the paper to see how we manage with this calibration. And right now, I'm just gonna explain to you the semi-parametric approach very, very fast, and then I will come to the results. Okay, so actually this model is parametric. So here you assume that you have your 48-dimension vector, and you have one model for each half hour, and this function actually model the expectation of the consumption, and then you add some noise. And here the noise is a bit specific, like it's Gaussian, but we also model the variance of this Gaussian. So these variance depend on the half hour and also on the tariff. So for example, we observe on the data that in the night, the variance was much lower than in the day. So this is why we wanted to have this specific modeling. As well as when you apply a high tariff, for example, you increase your variability. And this can be done with this kind of model. And here, the matrix here is just to model the correlation between 2 half hours of the same day. So like that, you can take this kind of information into account. Okay. So right now, I'm gonna show you the results. So yeah, we split the dataset in 2 parts, one training set, one testing set. And here I'm gonna show you the results. So in this first experiment, so this is the data generated for a single cluster. The black line is the observation, and the gray line are some simulation generated with the same historical context as in the datasets, okay? So, and the bold line here is just the mean of the different simulation. So what you can see is that the semi-parametric approach is quite good to estimate the average consumption, whereas the black box approach is a bit less good at that. But for the semi-parametric approach, it seems that the simulations are quite erratic, like the variance is too high, whereas here the trajectory are more coherent, what I think is better. Okay, then we try to simulate data, but now we change the contextual variable. So here, the black lines are what happened when we put a normal tariff for all the day. The brown line as when we put a low tariff in the morning, and the yellow curves are when a high tariff has been applied in the night. Okay, so for the first approach, you can see here that it is actually quite interpretable. So here you applied a low tariff, so there is a raise of the consumption, and here you applied a high tariff, so there is a drop of the consumption. It's quite logical and quite interpretable. But with the black box approach, we observe some different things. Actually, for example, here you applied a low tariff. Okay, so there is a rise of the consumption, okay. But what you can see here is that there is a drop of the consumption during the night. Actually, it seems that people who consume here have no need to consume in the night. And this is really good that this black box approach managed to take into consideration this rebound effect that is actually well known for the people who look at power consumption. Okay, so I will have a lot more to say, but I think that this is almost the end. So here it's some simulation for the various clusters, and you can see that the generated sample differ from a cluster to another. And I think that this is good. This show that our clustering approach was good, and that we divided correctly the house according to their responsiveness responsiveness to a tariff profile. So thank you all for your attention, and I also thanks a lot Ricardo Bessa and also Kamal for explaining me the causality model, and also the other Ricardo for his help with TensorFlow.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you stop sharing, please?
Yeah.
And I think it was a very fine presentation also, and you did well within your time. Thank you so much. It's very interesting. Maybe you, audience, maybe you have noticed that these two works have a link. So the research goes like that. In a team, you develop some piece, another person develops another piece, but they must have some meaning together. And in this case, the idea of generating, let's call them synthetic series, it's still learning from data. It's still learning from data, but now to generate behaviors that were not represented but they must be coherent with what you have observed. And we have some questions, and I invite the audience to ask some more questions. We need to put this lady to work, so she must sweat to answer the questions. But I have here the first one from Fabianzinho. I suspect who this guy is, but only from the name Fabianzinho, it's not enough to clearly identify the guy. But he wrote, "Thank you for the interesting, well-presented work, Margot." Okay, he's a gentleman. And then he wrote, "Imagine if the current Director General of the Energy Branch of the European Commission is watching your presentation and is inviting you to come over and discuss your model to inform energy policy design. How would you convince him to try your generator rather than launching empirical studies on consumer responsiveness?"
Yeah. This is a good question. Actually, I think that it's important to test our. Okay, my PhD is we are at the very beginning of the process, and I think that it's really important to test it with simulation before trying to test it on an empirical study on consumer. I think that we cannot say, this generator costs almost nothing. A bit of electricity for the computer, but that's it. Whereas launching an empirical study is a lot of money, and we want to be sure that we are not doing crazy things. Okay. I also think that simulation, I think, are also good because you can test them with a very, very, very large population, and this is not really possible with an empirical study. But yeah, of course, this generator is perfectible. I didn't show you here, but in the paper we discussed the pros and cons of both generators, and actually the black box approach is not really good when you want to generalize. Like, for example, if you feed to the decoders some contextual variables that have not been observed in the original data, then the generated data are doing things very, very strange. And we are thinking about enriching the data sets with other experiment, like doing a big pool of all the experiments that have already been done. But this come with new techniques, like with transfer learning. And if INESC want me to come back and do this work, but
so you got addicted to the port wine, I see.
yeah, exactly.
So you want to go back. Well. The thing is, the question was very interesting because it relates not only to science, but also to policymakers. How to convince policymakers to use these models, because in some cases they would be more comfortable. We looked at the data and doing a survey, etc., etc. But there is a clear advantage of this approach, and I'm relating this to the question from Chen Dan Li. He starts by saying, "Thanks for your intriguing presentation." and the thing is that we met this problem in other areas and other domains. The general problem is how to generate synthetic series, but learning from data. For how to, let's say, represent a hidden model that explains the outputs, explains observed behavior. Now you discover the hidden model from data, but then this hidden model allows you to generate things that were not observed. Basically, we did this also in wind power forecasting, for instance, when you need to generate synthetic series of wind power from observed data, and there is also the problem of the concept drift in the data. If first you assume that the behavior is always the same, but behavior may change in time, and you need to capture that as well. Yeah. Anyway, so the question was, intriguing presentation. Is it possible to build a model using first principles without any external data? So I would assume based on some logic that explains the behavior, etc. And this is the question. Would you think it is possible?
That's quite difficult to. Actually, the thing is that we needed external data because there are some inputs. I mean, the prices, for example, are input. We wanted that when you put different prices, the generated sample are changing, because this is what GR policy is doing. So I'm not sure I'm completely understanding the question.
Well, if I can help in some way, let's see. If you could devise by some logic theory some set of rules explaining the behavior, that would be a principal thing, not coming from the data. But I find it personally difficult. But I think the question is also intriguing, and I find it sort of difficult. But it is possible to conceive a model that instead of generating that, like, they would extract from the observed behavior, would extract rules, and then these rules could generate also some sort of series. That is a theoretically possible way. But this approach was not based on generating rules, was based on an autoencoder principle. The problems with autoencoders is their proper training. Training may be very difficult with autoencoders, but there are ways to go around. But the first half of an autoencoder is basically is something that we can train separately with the deep learning techniques. Instead of training everything in a batch, okay, we can train only the first half of the autoencoder that gets you much better model than to build the decoder, etc. So we have some more questions. I need to rush to the questions. There is one small question from Valerie Livina. I don't know if I'm pronouncing correctly. What are the time values on the x-axis of your plots? Just a short question. Are these diurnal cycles? It says 24 hours cycles every day.
It's like the days. It's something like, I think it was like 3 or 4 days of the.
Yes, days, diurnal cycles. That's correct. So the next question is, if consumption pattern changes, if consumption pattern changes, must be, there's a typo here, changes seasonally, you will need to retrain the model. That's the assumption here in the question. How many parameters in total do you use, and how long it takes to retrain it?
Okay, so actually it's okay. I skipped some details, but in the context vectors, we put in the input of the encoder and decoder. We also put the day of the week, the temperature, and a variable that encodes the position in the year. So I think that the season is a context in a way. So there is no need to retrain it. But maybe, yeah, I mean, we only had a year of data, so it's quite difficult to answer to this question because, you know, like sometimes you have some trend also in the power consumption when you are looking at the consumption over few years. So yeah, maybe, I mean, it's not an adaptative model, so maybe sometimes you should, retrain it. Yeah.
But,
it depends of your computer.
The question also includes a suggestion, which is, after testing these models, why not looking at adaptive models? And that is also goes in the line of what I said about the need to tackle with the concept drift. If let's say if the probabilistic model that explains behavior is changing, we need to detect that to adapt the model. So this will be a good suggestion for your next steps in your work.
Yes.
Yeah, and so Spiros Chadoulos, I don't know. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing correctly the name. I don't want to insult you with some bad name due to my bad pronunciation. Thank you for your presentation. Have you considered or compared generative adversarial networks to your generation approach?
Yeah, we tried this approach. Actually, it was our first idea, but we faced, okay, I can't remember the name of the problem, but the thing is that, okay, so in a GAN, so you have two networks. The first one is generated, and the second one try to detect the simulated data from the real data. And it was really, it was, I mean, I think that this problem happened a lot, and it's quite difficult to solve it because sometimes it's just because you have not enough data or things like that. But actually, the generator were always taking one data, and he was always sending this data to the discriminators. So then the discriminators try to say, okay, so this is a real data, this is a real data, this is a real data. Oh, no, this is not a real data. And then, no. And it was like some circle like that. And when the generator understand that the discriminator has found that it was a simulated data, he was picking another sample and all that stuff. And actually, our GAN never converged. So we said, okay, we are going to try something else.
Thank you. And keeping on the first question from Chendan Lee about using a prior model, he said maybe also, for example, like a simulating model mimicking many participants. Without using the data, but using a simulating model for the participants. Before you answer, I would say, well, then you need to model the model of participants, and how you model the model is by using some data about the behavior of the participant. Then you put, so that, I don't think there is any way you can escape data. If you don't use data about behavior, you have to use data to model the participants to put in the model.
Yeah,
but this is me, just me saying so.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I completely agree, but I also wanted to add the thing that it's actually very, very difficult to model individual consumption, whereas when you take a pool of consumer, like maybe 50, always, I mean, more easier.
Yeah, and there is another problem that is linked with the last question from Valerie. which is what if the year that you are now attacking is anomalous and different from the years used in the training? What if? And I was talking about concept drift, and there's a second thing, which is outlier behavior. Okay, that there will be always some outliers. You cannot easily model directly, but they may happen. And Marco, thing is, how do you detect that the year is enough different? Right. Of course, you should not apply a model for one behavior when the behavior is different. So if the year is anomalous, you should have novelty detectors to detect that the year is enough different that I should somehow retrain, sort of online retraining, etc. Did you think of this? Have you thought about this?
Yeah, just a bit, but yeah, this is really very difficult because okay, so in the data we used with Kamal, actually the experiment were only for a year, so this is why we only took a year of experiment. But of course, if we are thinking about putting some, I mean, to generalize this model to over years, we definitely have to check if the data are similar. Yeah.
Yeah, but there is something here. Let me just say this. If you are using an autoencoder principle, the autoencoders themselves act like novelty detectors. Because if the input is enough different from the data set the autoencoder has learned, the error between input and output will be significant. And you can detect there is something going wrong about this data because the network has not learned this data. So in your technique, you already have half of the answer to this thing, right? Because instead of using the autoencoder to generate synthetic series, you can use it as a novelty detector. If the input-output difference is too large, it's because it's the data arriving are not on the manifold of the data learned by the autoencoder. So, oops, something wrong here. So you already have some answer there. Sorry to answer for you.
No, I think it's thank you for this answer. It's really useful. Yeah.
Kamal, you want to say something, please?
Yeah,
put on your camera, please.
Sorry, yeah, I just wanted to add to that as well. So this is this year being a year where most of the people are at home would be a really different consumption pattern. So if this year's data is used to analyze this, certainly the question that was just posted will have a different impact. So yes, this is quite a interesting thing.
Great. And we have a last comment from Valerie saying that what we said is correct. In the context of demand forecast, the outliers are of main interest for energy operators. Yes, I agree. They already know there is an anomaly. They need to know how much energy to supply. Okay, yes. Actually, that's true in many cases. We model the main behavior, then the outliers are the most interesting thing because that's where the risk is. The normal behavior, then there is no risk. And the risk and the impact, etc., is in the outlier. So this is also something to pay attention to. But I want to thank the audience for the questions. They allowed us to have some lively discussion, and they injected some new ideas for the coming works. And it's about time to close this webinar, but I would like to invite you to pay attention to our website, because we will be announcing the next webinar with the next exciting topic. And hopefully we will have more time to have discussions and build a sort of a friendly network around this topic. Again, I say that these webinars were not thought to be tutorials or to be classes or to be conference presentations. They are actually live discussions of science and how we are progressing. So, and in this case, this is a very important topic, and I hope you all have enjoyed, or at least leave this webinar with your ideas challenged by these presentations. Everybody is welcome to visit INESC TEC someday in their lives. Of course, we need to have some more precautions during this pandemic time. So I advise you all to stay safe and come back and meet us next month in the new webinar. Thank you very much from the heart to everybody. Thank you. And the webinar is closed. I will shut down the screen. Thank you so much.